Live TV used to be our window to the world, but sometimes it broadcasts the exact moment a human life ends. Hi, you're watching Last Moments. Today, we got 6 broadcast disasters. Come on in. From a parade where a 30-foot float fell directly into the crowd, to a reporter who was covering an aftermath where a sneaky aftershock was about to deliver more devastating breaking news. It was August 18th, 2017, on a wide parade corridor in Surakarta, Central Java, Indonesia, where a city celebrating its annual cultural festival had no reason yet to expect that the afternoon would end with ambulances and shattered fiberglass cooling on the pavement. Rizwan Pradana was 34 years old and ran a small electronics repair shop in a mid-level commercial district of the city. He was not a man who sought out crowds, but he closed early on parade days, a habit held since his own childhood, and that afternoon he had brought his 12-year-old nephew. He stood near the front barrier with the confidence of someone who had done this before and knew the best angle. Looking at it from a bigger perspective, I think his decision to stand at the front barrier was not careless. The barriers existed precisely to mark where spectators could safely stand, and he was inside them, not beyond them. He positioned his nephew slightly behind him, a small, instinctive thing, the kind of thing you do without naming it. The float was the procession's centerpiece, a fiberglass mythological creature constructed at nearly 30 feet tall, mounted on a wheeled platform. The support frame had sustained cracking during transport the previous day, and had been repaired overnight. That repair had not been formally assessed before the float re-entered the route the following morning. Television cameras followed it throughout the procession because it was the visual anchor of the entire event. That unassessed repair isn't a footnote, it's the smoking gun, and someone's corner cutting is directly responsible for that boy's trauma. The float had been navigating narrow street sections for approximately 40 minutes when witnesses near the front began noticing the upper sculpture described as swaying sharply beyond what the turns alone could account for. A parade marshal walking alongside had looked up at the figure at least twice in the preceding 3 minutes, according to staff statements. No stop order was issued. The turn at the barrier section was a left curve of approximately 40 degrees. Witnesses standing across the road described hearing 3 distinct cracking sounds. Sharp, dry, not loud enough to carry over the music within roughly 2 seconds. A woman near a refreshment cart said she heard it and looked up before she understood what she was seeing. Parade staff on the float's right flank began waving and shouting almost immediately. The crowd hesitated. Several spectators raised their phones. The assumption, consistent across witness statements, was that the movement was deliberate. That split-second confusion is terrifying because I can imagine myself freezing in the exact same way. The upper section leaned forward at an angle witnesses described as a sudden, severe forward tilt before the base connection failed entirely. It did not fall cleanly. The structure broke at multiple stress points as it came down, sending the creature's head section, later estimated by investigators to weigh several hundred pounds, directly into the front barrier row. Rizwan was struck by that section. The headpiece and his body impacted the metal barrier simultaneously. A woman 6 feet to his left was knocked sideways by a secondary panel. His nephew, standing slightly behind, was struck by debris but remained upright. Multiple witnesses described the sound of the barrier bending under impact. Others described seeing spectators disappear beneath falling panels before anyone nearby had moved. Footage from a television crew positioned 30 feet back captured the collapse in full before the live broadcast switched to a different camera angle. A police officer near the entry corridor radioed for emergency services within roughly 1 minute of the collapse. Ambulances arrived within several minutes, but it was too late for Rizwan. The weight and force of the head section was sufficient to cause fatal damage on contact. Parade operations were suspended pending structural review of the failed support system. Rizwan's nephew sustained non-life-threatening injuries and was treated and released. Overall, I feel this entire incident is a harsh reminder that one overlooked structural failure can collapse an entire sense of public safety in seconds. That first story is a classic cast of the wrong place at the wrong time. Are you ready for more? Come on. It was May 9th, 2018, on a construction site in Shenzhen, China, where the wind had been wrong all morning, and everyone working above the 40th floor already knew it. Meilin Xiao was 29 years old and worked as a field reporter for a regional television station. She had spent 4 years covering transportation, infrastructure, and business development, the kind of beats that don't generate viewer mail, but require a reporter who shows up on time and asks the right questions without being told what they are. I respect that grind immensely. She wasn't chasing fame, she was was just doing the job right. She had pitched the skyscraper segment herself, framing it around the city's vertical expansion and what that pace of development meant for labor and logistics. Her cameraman that day was Jun Hao, 41, a staff operator with 17 years of field experience. The 62-story building had a tower crane near the top, actively lifting steel when the crew arrived that morning. Malin had arranged site access through public relations, and the segment was planned for a live midday broadcast.
I think about the fact that nobody from the site appears to have flagged the morning's wind readings to the broadcast crew before they set up.
That is not speculation. Investigators later confirmed that wind speed concerns had been raised internally among construction workers before the crew arrived, and that information did not reach anyone outside the site's own chain. And honestly, that silence makes me furious. It was a failure of basic human decency to warn people walking into a danger zone. Additionally, workers noticed unusual sideways movement in the crane boom and reported it verbally and in writing, but the issue never escalated beyond the foreman. Despite the warning, the crane remained in operation, and the handling of the report afterward is unclear.
I don't assign that to malice. I assign it to the particular institutional failure where discomfort gets absorbed into routine because stopping costs more than continuing.
The live segment began at 12:17. Malin was positioned at ground level, approximately 200 feet from the building's base, describing the project's scale to camera. At 12:19, witnesses on surrounding scaffolding reported hearing a sharp mechanical report from the upper structure, described by one worker as the sound of a cable under tension, releasing suddenly, dry and flat, not an explosion. The crane's boom fractured at the slewing ring interface connecting the upper rotating assembly to the mast system, initiating a rapid loss of structural stability. Roughly 50 tons of combined structural steel, counterweight segments, and suspended rigging began separating from the mounting in a cascading failure.
At ground level, the first indication on the live feed was Malin stopping mid-sentence and looking upward.
Jun Hao redirected the camera toward the building face. The footage that aired later reviewed in the broadcast station's internal inquiry shows approximately 4 seconds of upward-facing camera movement before the frame fills with dust and the audio registers a sequence of heavy metallic impacts in rapid succession. The transmission failed 11 seconds after the initial structural separation. Site supervisors contacted emergency services within roughly 90 seconds of the collapse. Both Malin and Jun Hao were located beneath collapsed scaffolding and debris material by construction workers already on scene. Investigators later determined that sections of falling crane components had struck exterior scaffolding, causing a secondary collapse that extended hundreds of feet from the building and into the area where the broadcast crew had been positioned. Both were pronounced dead at the scene. The broadcast station aired a memorial segment 3 days later. Investigators cited failures in enforcing stop work authority and inadequate communication between crane operators and site safety management during live lifting operations. This wasn't a freak accident, it was a slow-motion decision to ignore every warning sign because stopping a crane costs money, but apparently 2 lives cost even less to the people in charge. The crane that killed Malin was built by human hands, something designed, approved, and signed off on. The next one had no blueprints, no engineers, and no one to hold accountable. It was January 24th, 2016, at Rogers Pass in British Columbia. The snowpack had been building for 3 days, a silent, patient weight pressing down on the mountainside, and Taran Debicki, a man who understood the science of snow, was standing directly in its path. Taran was 38 years old and worked as a regional meteorologist for a mid-sized broadcast network based in Western Canada. He had covered mountain weather segments for nearly a decade, earning a reputation among colleagues for being thorough and physically willing. He volunteered twice monthly at a youth science program in his city. He was experienced, prepared, and operating within parameters that had been used before at that location.
Yet, I cannot shake the feeling that his very competence made him overconfident. And I would argue that is the cruelest irony here.
The observation point had been selected by regional officials as a relatively low-risk location for field documentation during winter road closures. Tied to Parks Canada avalanche control operations along the Trans-Canada Highway corridor through Rogers Pass, he had used comparable setups on earlier assignments. His camera crew had stationed themselves roughly 150 feet further back along the access road behind a vehicle which was standard for this type of segment. The avalanche warnings in effect effect that morning covered the broader pass zone, not that specific point. That distinction probably felt meaningful at the time. The live broadcast segment had been running for approximately 4 minutes when the visible conditions began shifting in ways the footage captures clearly. Wind-driven snow was already cascading off the upper ridgeline behind him in continuous sheets. The slope behind his position held a fresh slab layer, dense, unanchored, deposited over a weaker crystal layer from an earlier cold spell.
And if you're familiar with those words, you'd know that combination is one of the most well-documented avalanche triggers in winter meteorology.
What the footage shows in the seconds before the fracture line appeared is ordinary. A man in a red jacket standing in deep cold, speaking toward a camera, wind audible over his voice, slope behind him, indistinct through blowing snow. There was no visible sign of what was building above the frame. The cameraman, positioned at elevation with a wider sightline, saw the fracture first, he shouted. The word was not recovered clearly in audio review, but his movement was immediate. He lowered the camera slightly and began moving backward. Taran turned toward the slope. The fracture line, later estimated at over 300 feet across, had already separated a slab roughly 2 feet deep across its full width. He ran. I don't think running was the wrong instinct. I think it was the only instinct available, and it still wasn't enough. The slab did not fall cleanly. It broke apart as it accelerated, picking up the dry snow beneath it and compressing it forward in a rolling, churning mass. The debris cloud rose quickly, reducing visibility to near zero across the lower slope. Taran's figure is visible in the footage for approximately 3 seconds after the fracture running, then stumbling on the uneven roadway surface, then gone. There was no point in the footage where the crew could have reached him. Recovery operations used avalanche transceivers, probe lines, and avalanche rescue dogs already deployed in the corridor, but did not locate Taran until several hours later due to the depth and density of the debris field. The network that employed him suspended all field mountain segments indefinitely and issued a formal review of field positioning protocols. It's hard to accept that a man who read snow for a living ended up crushed by it, and I say that is not nature's cruelty, but our own hubris in choosing that exact spot. Taran had no control over what the mountain decided to do that morning. The next one had every variable planned, every second rehearsed, and still ran out of both. It was November 14, 2014, in Almaty, Kazakhstan, inside a mid-sized television production hall. Nothing about the staging suggested anything other than spectacle, and that was precisely the problem.
I can already feel how easily this kind of setup tricks everyone into relaxing when they absolutely should not.
Yerlan Sadikov was 37 and had spent 15 years working as a stage illusionist across Kazakhstan's corporate and theatrical circuit. He regularly rehearsed escape mechanics, kept detailed handwritten notebooks on his rigs, and had completed over 200 performances without needing emergency intervention. The live primetime special was the largest production he had ever been attached to. The stunt had been planned for 4 months and involved Yerlan being suspended upside down above a sealed transparent tank, lowered into the water, and required to free himself using a concealed pick before reaching a timed exit hatch. Backup divers were positioned on either side with instructions to intervene if he exceeded the safety window or signaled distress under a safety officer with override authority. The restraint system had been tested successfully during rehearsals without any incidents. A mechanical inspection had been completed 48 hours prior.
I can't ignore how many layers of safety still depend on timing and interpretation instead of immediate action.
The live broadcast began at 8:45 in the evening. When Yerlan was rigged into the ankle restraints and raised above the tank, the hall went quiet in the particular way a crowd does when it has decided to hold its breath. I feel like that kind of silence from a crowd always makes things feel more final than anyone wants to admit in the moment. He descended head first. The tank sealed. The production monitor clock began running. The backup divers held position. Everything moved as designed. Within seconds of full submersion, his right hand went immediately to his left ankle and stayed there. The audience saw a man working against a lock, which was exactly what he was supposed to be doing, and so they responded with applause.
I think that applause in that moment is exactly how real danger gets misread as performance.
30 seconds past his expected escape window, the production floor had not yet escalated. The monitor showed movement. Several crew members reviewed their timing sheets rather than the tank itself. He was kicking against the restraint now, not the controlled movement of a rehearsed sequence, but the short, urgent kind that carries no rhythm. Air was leaving his mouth in irregular bursts. An audience member in the third row later told investigators she noticed his body tension change, but assumed it was part of the act. Another said he appeared to be straining harder than expected, but could not clearly interpret whether it was scripted. 3 people in the front section began standing before the production team moved.
I feel frustrated reading this part of the report because I can see how many human instincts picked up the warning signs before the actual system did.
At this point, the safety escalation protocol began to activate in stages rather than immediately deploying divers, as the first threshold required confirmation from the safety officer that the movement was outside performance variance. When the divers entered, he had already gone still. His eyes were open. His arms had drifted slightly upward, and his body had ceased any independent movement. The divers reached him in under 20 seconds from entry. The hatch was opened manually. He was pulled to the surface and removed from the tank onto the stage floor. Ambulances arrived in roughly 9 minutes, but he was declared dead after resuscitation attempts. The coroner's report identified the cause of death as asphyxiation due to drowning. I think the hardest part for me is how quickly something so staged and controlled turned into something irreversible without the system ever fully switching gears in time. The network permanently shelved the broadcast. Investigators issued findings to the regional entertainment licensing body. The production hall was cleared and returned to standard configuration within a week. Now, the next man wasn't performing for a crowd, but he died with a camera in his hand for the same reason. Neither of them stopped when they should have. It was February 27th, 2019, in the Thrissur district of Kerala, India. That day, the sound was wrong, the air was thick, and the third elephant in the procession was moving in a way that made the hair stand up on the back of a seasoned cameraman's neck. Ajit Nair was 46 years old and worked as a cameraman for a regional broadcasting outlet, covering religious festivals and public processions across the district for nearly 2 decades. He was not widely known outside his industry, but within it, he had a reputation for steady footage under difficult conditions. He arrived that morning with a shoulder-mounted camera and a press identification lanyard, positioned near the central corridor where 3 decorated elephants were moving through the procession route within a controlled ceremonial buffer zone maintained by police and volunteers. He was there for a live coverage of the event. The procession had been underway for roughly 2 hours when the third elephant began showing what handlers and experienced observers would have recognized immediately. Its ears were moving in wide, repeated arcs. Its trunk swung laterally rather than hanging loose.
I have to highlight that these are not subtle indicators. Anyone who works around captive elephants in ceremonial settings knows them.
Handlers tightened their rope formation and issued commands as the elephant grew increasingly agitated. Firecrackers had been detonating along the route all morning, and because the animal had responded to intervention during earlier, less severe episodes, handlers believed the situation was still manageable.
I'm not very familiar with their culture, but what I do know is that the handlers in those minutes already knew something was building, and they still chose to continue the celebration.
A louder than previous firecracker exploded unexpectedly about 15 feet to the animal's right, triggering an immediate panic response. The elephant reared and surged forward, briefly held by the ropes as handlers were pulled off balance before control was lost. What followed was a large animal moving at speed through a space nominally restricted for ceremonial passage, but overwhelmed by crowd density, pressing into the buffer zone, and the geometry of that was terrible for everyone standing in it. Crowd pressure started building at the edges as people instinctively moved back before realizing what was happening. The closest spectators had no time to react as the elephant's mounted platform struck a barricade and spun it into the crowd, knocking 3 people down in the initial impact. Witnesses reported heavy, compressed impact sounds as the animal moved through obstacles, including a woman near the press area being driven into a concrete barrier and remaining down. Police officers began shouting evacuation orders within the first 30 seconds. The press area sat roughly 40 feet from the initial point of contact. Members of the news crew began pulling back. Ajit did not. Witnesses who were already retreating said he remained turned toward the animal, still holding the frame. I don't know what's going through his mind. I can only speculate that it was 2 decades of instinct that said, hold the shot. And on this particular afternoon, that instinct did not serve him. A witness standing approximately 20 feet behind him described the elephant turning toward the remaining crew. Ajit was struck across his upper body and thrown roughly 8 feet, landing on his side on the paved surface. Alas, the animal did not stop. Its front legs stepped through its forward motion, compressing his torso during a continuous stride as it continued forward. The live feed was immediately cut. Temple volunteers and police officers called for ambulances within the first 2 minutes of the stampede beginning. Medical teams arrived in approximately 10 minutes. Ajit was transported to a regional hospital and pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Festival organizers in the district introduced revised crowd distance requirements in the months following. The elephant was removed from ceremonial service. Ajit spent 2 decades learning exactly where to stand. He was good at it, and on February 27th, everything that made him good at it told him to stay. Our last story is the same instinct, different disaster, except this time the warning wasn't an agitated animal. It was a building. It was September 20th, 2017, in the downtown corridor of Mexico City, Mexico, where the city was still reeling from the previous day's earthquake and the buildings left standing were still negotiating with gravity. Lucia Varela was 32 years old and worked as a field reporter for a small regional television station covering local government, community stories, and city affairs. She had spent 6 years earning a staff position from an unpaid internship. The earthquake the previous afternoon, a 7.1 magnitude event, had already killed hundreds across the city before noon. By early afternoon, Lucia was downtown with a cameraman, filing live segments from a street where emergency crews were actively mapping structural damage. Reporters had worked that street all day, and emergency workers were operating in the same zone. The decision to be there was not a deviation, it was the job.
What is harder for me to account for is the specific position she chose.
Clearly visible behind her in earlier broadcast segments was a mid-rise office building with diagonal crack lines running across its upper facade and a measurable lean that several emergency workers had already flagged during assessment. The perimeter was being expanded at the time she was reporting, not yet completed, still actively moving. She was inside a zone that was simultaneously a working area and a hazard zone.
I don't think anyone on that block had a complete picture of what was about to happen.
After a minor aftershock, an emergency coordinator saw the building begin to tilt more noticeably and warned others just before debris started falling. Large concrete pieces broke off first, striking the street and forcing nearby responders to run. The collapse happened in stages rather than all at once, with different parts of the facade failing sequentially. Glass shattered first, followed by heavier structural sections producing a deep, escalating grinding sound as the building came down. The cameraman had turned and was running while still filming. The live broadcast feed, reviewed afterward, shows the sidewalk tilting in frame, then a mass of gray filling the lens from above. Lucia's voice is audible on the recording for approximately 1 second before the signal cuts. Both crew members were buried under an estimated 6 to 8 feet of rubble. Witnesses behind emergency vehicles on the opposite side described a sudden surge of dust and displaced air that washed across the street in the immediate vicinity. A civilian near the perimeter edge placed the first emergency call. Firefighters already staged on the block initiated rescue operations. Specialized heavy rescue teams reached the collapse zone shortly after initial access was secured. After several hours of excavation, responders recovered both bodies from beneath a collapsed section of facade and sidewalk debris near where the camera feed had cut. The coroner's findings listed the cause of death for both crew members as blunt force trauma consistent with crush injury from structural collapse. The station aired a brief community segment in the days following, acknowledging Lucia and her cameraman by name. In the broader accounting of that day, which killed hundreds across the city, their deaths became one entry among many. I don't think that's wrong. Scale demands proportion. But there is something that sits poorly about a story folding into the footnotes of a larger disaster when the people in it were doing exactly what they were sent to do. On-site journalists who stand in rubble while it is still unsettled deserve recognition that outlasts the news cycle that consumed them.
If you enjoyed today's video, go ahead and hit that like button and go ahead and subscribe. You know you want to. I'm doing these videos. Come on, do me a favor. We'll see you next week.